Hi everyone, I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome to the Sky News Daily, which, as you can probably tell by the background hum, is coming to you from the Labour Party conference in Liverpool. But given what's taking place in the Middle East, you'll understand, I'm sure, if we park the politics, for now at least. I was sitting in the sunshine on Saturday when I first learned of the Hamas assault on Israel, and the clouds quickly gathered. Striking by land, sea and air, the terrorist group caught Israel completely off guard. The brutality of their attack was revealed in videos posted to Hamas-affiliated social media channels. Hostages, bloodied and bruised, paraded in front of braying crowds. Gunmen on the streets firing indiscriminately at anything, at anyone that moved. Bodies riddled with bullet wounds, mouths and eyes forever frozen open in that moment of death. The attack has been met with an equally bloody response. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has promised to end Hamas. To do so, it is unlikely there are any lines he will not cross. Thousands have lost their lives. Thousands more will soon join them. Today, we're asking, quite simply, why? Alistair Bunkall is our Middle East correspondent, and he joins us now. Alistair, just tell us where you are and what the mood is.
Well, I'm currently in Jerusalem, where it is eerily quiet. There are barely any cars on the streets, and it's a Monday. You know, the streets would normally be packed here, both with people who live here, but also it's a big tourist city. None of that. Businesses are closed, schools are closed, shops are closed. It's almost as if when these attacks happened on Saturday morning, people retreated inside their houses and they haven't left since. And we've been travelling around parts of Israel today, parts of sort of central Israel, down towards the south, and you regularly pass sort of temporary police checkpoints, military vehicles, convoys of military vehicles pass you on the road as they head south towards Gaza. It's a very eerie atmosphere. I've lived here for a few years. I've never known it like this. And colleagues of ours who've lived here all their lives, they too have never known the atmosphere to be quite like it is at the moment.
Alistair, we're recording this at Monday lunchtime British time. Just give us your best idea of the security situation across Israel at the moment. Where is the fighting taking place, and how secure is the country currently?
So the main fighting is down in the south, which is not very far away from here, I should say. I mean, Israel is a very small country, but it's down in the south near the Gaza border. Now, the last briefing that I got from the Israeli military this morning suggested there were 7 to 8 pockets of fighting going on inside Israeli territory still. There are some reports around at the moment suggesting that the Israeli military have now retaken control of all of Israeli land, but I'm not entirely sure that's accurate because there are some counter reports that there are some hostage situations still ongoing. The Gaza border fence, which is how this all started when it was breached on Saturday, the IDF, that's the Israeli Defense Forces, have managed to plug the holes in most of it and rebuild it in areas, but not all of it. So certainly this morning there were still Hamas fighters making it through the border fence and into Israel, which is extraordinary. I mean, 48 hours after this first happened. I don't think huge numbers of fighters are still coming in, but some are. And then you've got the prospect that some of the fighters who originally made it in haven't been killed, haven't been captured, haven't returned to Gaza, but instead have melted into the Israeli society and are now looking to act as sleeper cells.
Alistair, what resources are the Israelis throwing at this conflict, particularly in and around Gaza? Listening to Benjamin Netanyahu yesterday talking about Israel using everything at their disposal. I mean, give us an idea of what military units are being put into this for.
So in terms of trying to clear the towns and villages within Israel that were infiltrated by Hamas fighters, that initially fell to regular IDF soldiers who were close by and did a lot of the Gaza fence protection. But since Israeli special forces have now been involved in doing that because they are experts in trying to sort out hostage situations, for example. The Israelis have called up 300,000 reservists. They've been flying back from all over the world, young men and women, to join up with their units. It's not just around Gaza, though. That is where the focus is at the moment. But if the Israelis pour all of their resources into the Gaza area, they then neglect the West Bank and the northern border, which is why it is so complex for them.
And of course, the blockade of Gaza involves switching off the water, switching off the electricity as well.
It does. They are literally going to try and starve Hamas and, of course, by connection, the Gazan people into, I think the purpose of it is to try and force them to give back the many hostages they're taken. I say many hostages, we've not been given an exact number. I think partly that's for operational security reasons on the Israeli part, but I think in a large part because they're not entirely sure themselves how many people have been taken. But we are probably talking significantly in excess of 100. I mean, unthinkable hostage situations that the Israelis are now having to deal with. In the past, we've had hostage situations with Israelis taken into Gaza. It's been one or two people. And that has played on the country's mind, the country's psyche, in a big, big way. Now we're dealing with many, many more than that. And so I think the purpose of switching off electricity, water, stopping food, stopping fuel from going into Gaza is, of course, just simply to make life unbearable for Hamas, but to try and pressure them into giving back these hostages and maybe get Gazans to turn on Hamas. I don't, for what it's worth, think that will happen. It's always a sort of an adage that Gazans turn on Hamas, which is the ruling party in Gaza, when things are quiet. When you have these upticks in violence, they tend to rally around each other more.
I mean, Alistair, you used the words unthinkable there when it comes to the taking of hostages. Talk to me a little bit about the tactics used by Hamas and indeed by the Israelis. The videos that have emerged from the initial 24 hours of this conflict, hostages being paraded around the streets of Gaza, elderly people being taken, women and children being taken. We can say with certainty, can't we, that the tactics that Hamas have deployed are illegal in terms of international law?
For sure. A large proportion of the people taken hostage were not soldiers in the Israeli military or members of the Israeli security forces. They were, as you say, elderly men and women, mothers and their children, and in some cases really young children. So yeah, without question, this is an act of extreme terrorism. Those videos which were circulating particularly on Saturday and Sunday, in some of them we see people calling particularly for women and children or the elderly to be treated properly. I wonder whether or not Hamas might be persuaded to release some of the elderly and some of the children. We'll wait and see whether that happens. But they will keep them now all around Gaza, above ground, underground. There is no sort of one prison, for example, that they'll be put in. They will be spread around Gaza. We're having reports coming into us that 4 of them have been killed in Israeli shelling, and that will weigh on the mind of the Israeli military commanders and the Israeli government, that they have a large number of their own civilians, their own people in Gaza. And if you're going to bomb Gaza with the intensity that they have been doing, you're going to risk killing some of them.
Some of these videos have been released by Hamas themselves or by Hamas-affiliated groups. I mean, they want the world to see what they have done, particularly the more gruesome, god-awful aspects of it.
Whether or not you buy this argument or not, and many people don't, but they would argue, to put their position across, that this is what the Israelis do to Palestinians regularly, particularly in the West Bank. They go and arrest them and keep them in prison on what's known as administrative detention, without charging them and without putting them on trial, for example. So they would argue that it's, fair game. It's not, but that's to put the Hamas perspective across in this. They know as well that they can use them as bargaining chips. They want a lot of their own prisoners released from Israeli prisons, and so if they've got 100, 150 Israeli civilians under their captivity, then they can use that as a bargaining chip. they will also be seen as victorious amongst many of their own people as well. So they'll be celebrated for it. These are, for many people, incredibly unpalatable scenarios to try and comprehend. But that is, from the Hamas point of view, the way they think that is their reality.
How did Israel not see this coming, Alistair? How did the much praised Israeli surveillance program not notice that Hamas was rearming, and that will have taken weeks, if not months, but then the build-up that there must have been in various pockets of Gaza before the incursion was made into Israel proper? Why did no one see this coming?
Honestly, I don't know, and I don't mean that flippantly. Nobody knows. People are asking that question now and wondering who was to blame. I think, for the most part, people recognise that those questions and that sort of investigation needs to come a bit later. There are more pressing issues at hand right now for Israel. But whether it's columnists in the national newspapers here, whether it's Israelis you speak to on the street, whether it's television commentators, whatever, people are saying, how on earth did this happen? Because, as you say, Neil, the Israeli surveillance is among the best in the world. The Israeli military are highly adept. They have an expensive and what was thought to be an impregnable border around the entirety of Gaza. They've got surveillance cameras monitoring it, and yet somehow the unthinkable happened. Now, there are rumours that have not been confirmed yet that there was perhaps a cyber attack on the camera surveillance system that blinded the Israelis. But these at the moment they're all guesses, really. But for sure, the day will come. I don't know when this will finish, but the day will come when the finger is being pointed at people, and I think it will be pointed at Benjamin Netanyahu. Ultimately, he's the man at the top. The buck stops with him. He's billed himself as Mr. Security in the past, but the darkest day in Israel's history has happened on his watch.
Alistair, there will be people who heard your previous point about Hamas saying, look, this is the sort of stuff that Israel has been doing to us and has been doing to us since time immemorial. But you and I both know, there is no principle of an eye for an eye in international law. And you look at some of the specific examples of what Hamas has done over the past 48 hours, and it turns your stomach. And I think in particular of that music festival, the Supernova Festival, where we have estimates of 250, 260 non-combatants, kids having fun at a music festival, being executed, being murdered in cold blood. What do you know about that situation?
Firstly, I don't want people to think I'm making a comparison between the Israeli military and Hamas. One is a recognised international military. The other one is a recognised terrorist organisation by many countries around the world, including the British, including the Americans, including the EU. So there is no equivalence, but it's never a bad thing to just stop and think about the way Hamas are seeing this and what might be their motive behind it. So that is why I sort of outline that. But ultimately, going into the music festival, as you reference, or going into kibbutz or mashava and going door to door and slaughtering people is an act of gross terrorism, in my opinion. In most people's opinion, there is no argument for that.
Where do you think, Alistair, this conflict will go next? I understand from conversations I have had with people at the Foreign Office and elsewhere that there is a concern about contagion, that people will be looking very closely, and you've mentioned them already, at what other militant groups, particularly Hezbollah in Lebanon, what they may well end up doing. I mean, the long and short of it is, no matter what anyone does, thousands of people have already died and thousands more will die as a result of this conflict.
Yeah, I'm afraid I think that is a certainty. There will be many, many more lives lost before this conflict is over. This is unprecedented. That is a fact. What has happened over the last 48 hours has never happened in the history of the state of Israel. Firstly, Israel has declared itself at war, which just puts the country on a completely different footing. They have been humiliated by Hamas, and there will now be an instinctive desire by the Israeli government and the Israeli military to somehow claw back the initiative somehow. And that inevitably, I think, means an almighty strike on Gaza. Now, whether that remains airstrikes or whether there's a land incursion, we'll have to see. I genuinely think all options are on the table at the moment.
I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu wants to wipe Hamas from the face of the earth. He has warned civilians in Gaza to get away. I mean, is it possible for those who live in Gaza to get away? It's commonly described by those who support the Palestinian cause as a prison. How true is that?
It is true, in so much that the Gaza Strip, for those who don't know it, runs, I think, 27 miles long by about 6 miles wide. And what you've got surrounding it is an Israeli border that was at least highly policed, controlled, and you've only got a couple of entry and exit points. There's an Israeli one called the Erez crossing, where as journalists we would go through, aid workers would go through, and up to 15,000 Gazans were allowed to leave every day to work in Israel. And then you've got a Rafah crossing down in the south into Egypt, but again, that is not an open crossing. And you have a sea blockade as well, meaning that Gazan fishermen can only go out so far to fish, that nothing can come into Gaza by sea. And then, of course, the air is all controlled by Israel as well. I mean, anyone who's ever spent any time in Gaza knows that you have the constant sound of Israeli drones overhead. So within that, you've got something like 2.1 million people living. Around 50% of those are under the age of 18. And the vast majority of them can't move. Many of them have never left Gaza in their life. It's very, very densely populated. And so if they are trying to escape the bombardment, I mean, simply, I don't know where they go. Unless you know that you might have a Hamas command station next door to you, and you might therefore want to leave elsewhere. It's just, there is nowhere to go. I mean, that's not, that is fact. And so suggesting that they move away, I'm really not sure how Gazans do that. And you have to remember in this that Hamas aside, as this militant group, this prescribed terrorist organisation, there are many, many thousands of Gazans who are not part of Hamas, who are not part of Islamic Jihad, who are mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, grandparents, whatever. And every time this happens, they are petrified about what might happen to them.
And Alistair, your thoughts on the obvious broader geopolitical ramifications of all of this. Israel was on the verge of normalizing relations with Saudi Arabia. It is pretty clear that there may well be an Iranian influence in all of this. I mean, what is the truth? I've heard so much speculation over the past 48 hours about the fact that Iranian hands are on the tiller here, that is why Hamas chose this particular moment to launch the biggest offensive that I can ever remember.
Do Iran fund Hamas? Yes. Do they supply them with weaponry where they can do? Yes. Have Iranian officials recently met with Hamas officials and Hezbollah officials? Yes. Would Hamas have warned Iran ahead of carrying out this operation? I think so. But did Iran direct it, strategize it? Were they heavily involved in the planning for this? I'm not sure we know that. The Israelis have said they're not, but I think actually tactically for the Israelis, they probably that suits them to sort of keep Iran out of it at the moment. What we don't know is the level of Iranian involvement in this. Certainly the Iranians have been against the prospect of this Saudi-Israeli peace deal that was gathering a lot of momentum in recent weeks and looked as though it might be reaching a point where it was going to happen within the coming weeks or months. The Iranians were against that. And therefore, I don't think the timing of this is entirely coincidental, although the planning for this will have gone on for months, one assumes, and will have preceded many of the negotiations for that peace deal. I still think that potential peace deal plays into this somehow. Where does that peace deal land now? Well, if it's going to happen, it's not going to happen as quickly as it might have otherwise done, and there was only a small time frame anyway, given that you've got US elections next year and the Americans were central to the mediation of it. I think probably if I was putting my money somewhere, I think that peace deal is probably dead for now. But whether or not I'm right will probably depend on Israel's actions over the coming days and weeks and the way the Saudis view it.
Ali, many thanks. You and the team stay safe.
Thanks, Neil.
Welcome back to The Daily, focusing on Israel from our studio at the Labour conference in Liverpool. Inside the secure zone, I have to say, pretty much everyone, delegates, MPs, shadow cabinet, they are all speaking with one voice on the atrocities committed by Hamas. Outside the wire, however, a pro-Palestinian protest is taking place.
Palestine! Free, free, Palestine! Free, free!
A reminder of the Corbyn years, where the party was plagued with accusations of anti-Semitism, of too close a relationship with figures associated with terrorism. Let's bring in our deputy political editor, Sam Coates, at this point, to kind of reflect on the fact that this is a moment of significance, of course, in terms of geopolitics, but it will be a moment of significance for Sir Keir Starmer, the man who wants to be the next Prime Minister. The tone of conference must have changed as a result of what we've been seeing play out in Gaza and in Israel.
The closest I can remember to a feeling like this here in Liverpool was back in 2001, when Tony Blair was due to speak at TUC conference in Brighton, and the news of those attacks, the Twin Towers, I think shortly after 8 a.m. East Coast time, shortly after 1 o'clock British time, emerged, and suddenly you had this great big political event that was no longer anything like as big as it was, but was entirely in the shadow of massive global events. That, this week, is what's happening here in Liverpool. Look, this conference, and you'll hear the hubbub around, and on one level it might even, to some of our listeners, sound a little bit jarring. This conference is going on, but plastered around the sides, up on the screens in this Sky News set, are the images of exactly what you and everybody you've been talking to today have been describing: haunting, sickening, depressing, worrying images. And yet, all around us, the moment that the Labour Party needed for itself to have as we run up to the most important bit of our political cycle is taking place.
And of course, you think back to Labour under Jeremy Corbyn and the very pro-Palestinian position taken by the Labour Party at that point.
I sent out a statement calling for a ceasefire, calling for peace, and calling for an end to the occupation of Palestine, which of course is fundamentally the background to the whole issue.
What journalists like you and I do at conferences like this is we run around, we look in the fringe events, we go to the stands, we try and doorstep, people that we think might give us a line, and we see if the party can hold the line, such as it has been. And they have done so far, haven't they?
At time of speaking, which is, and it's probably worth recording this, somewhere around lunchtime on Monday, it is quite remarkable that this Labour Party here in 2023 is so different from a Labour Party run by Jeremy Corbyn that only finished back into 2019, that we have had a Labour leader come out almost instantly that this conflict emerged and firmly side with Israel, and that there have not been any significant or even really noticeable dissenting views at any point in the first 48 hours of this conference. Now, behind the scenes, there has been a monumental effort to make sure that there aren't jarring statements, first and foremost from the party's MPs. But basically, the message has gone out: if you say anything that looks like it's giving succor to Hamas, we will suspend you. That message is heard loud and clear. And there is also a rapid back-channel network between the leadership and the left, actually John McDonnell being an incredibly important figure in this, in order to try and make sure that if there's even the sniff of somebody going off message, then they investigate it, they find out what's going on, they try and stop it. It is remarkable that this Labour Party is so different to the one Keir Starmer inherited that we have not been hearing that view that some might think gives succor to Hamas and would cause an instant and very toxic row about the nature of this Labour Party.
None of which is to say that there are not those on the left of this party that believe that Hamas actions were justified. It's just they're outside the secure zone. They're not being seen on the conference stage.
If it happened at the podium, I think it would be an absolute disaster for Keir Starmer, or at a fringe, or even at the kind of proxy event for the left at this conference, which is called the World Transformed, which is a little Corbynista event that takes place on the fringe, kind of not as important, nearly as important as it was 3-4 years ago. So nothing that we have seen or that has been brought to our attention.
Sam, we will talk again. For now, many thanks indeed. That is your lot for this edition of the Sky News Daily. We'll be back again from Liverpool tomorrow.